I was sleeping on my friend Marco's couch in São Paulo. Not a guest room, a couch. In a two-bedroom apartment in Pinheiros that Marco shared with his girlfriend, who was very kind about the situation and never once made me feel unwelcome, which required more generosity than I had any right to expect. There was a blanket on the couch that was not quite long enough for someone my height, and a pillow that was adequate, and a view of the street through the window that at 3 in the morning had the specific empty quality of a city that has gone to sleep and left you awake in it alone with your thoughts. I had been sleeping on that couch for 6 weeks. I was 66 years old. For 30 years, I had owned and operated 3 diners in the Chicago area, in Bridgeport, in Pilsen, and in a strip mall in Cicero that was not glamorous but that had, over 22 years, fed enough people often enough that the regulars had become something closer to extended family than customers. I had sold all 3 in December 2021. The total, after the broker and the lawyers and the taxes, was $580,000. I had worked for 30 years to arrive at that number. I had opened the first diner at 36 with a small business loan and a certainty that I could run a better operation than the places I had been working in since I was 19. I was right about that. I built it slowly, the way you build things when you do not have money to lose and understand that patience is the only substitute for capital. By year 5, the first diner was profitable. By year 12, I had opened the second. By year 22, the third. $580,000 was the sum of 30 years of 6-day weeks and 5:30 mornings and decisions about suppliers and staff and lease renewals and the specific grinding daily work of keeping 3 small businesses alive in a city that kills restaurants with the casual frequency of a city that has too many restaurants and not enough margin for error. I sold them because I was tired. That is the honest answer. Not tired of the work. I had always liked the work, the physical reality of a kitchen in the morning, the specific satisfaction of a room full of people eating food you had made a decision to serve. But tired in the deeper way, the way that 30 years of responsibility accumulates into a weight that you do not notice until you stop carrying it, and then you notice it by its absence. I sold in December. By March, I was in Rio. I want to tell you about the gap between December and March, because I think it is part of the story. Those 3 months in Chicago, after the sale and before the flight, were the strangest of my adult life. I had nowhere to be for the first time since I was 19 years old. No early alarm, no supplier calls, no staff scheduling. The diner in Bridgeport had been open 7 days a week for 28 years, which means I had organized my life around its schedule for 28 years. And without the schedule, the days had a shapelessness that I found, at 66, considerably more unsettling than I had expected freedom to feel. My daughter Linda, who is 38 and lives in Evanston and is the more cautious of my 2 children, asked me what I was going to do. I said I was going to go somewhere warm. She said, "How warm?" I said, "Brazil." She said, "Dad." I said, "What?" She said, "Just be careful." I said I was 66 years old and had been running 3 businesses since before she was born, and I knew how to be careful. She said, "I know, Dad. Just be careful." She was right to say it. I was wrong to dismiss it. My son Paul, 35, in Detroit, was more direct. He said, "How much are you taking?" I said, "The whole amount. It's in a brokerage account. I'll live off the returns." He said, "Are you actually going to live off the returns, or are you going to spend the principal?" I said, "The returns." He was quiet in the way he is quiet when he has an opinion he has decided not to express. Paul has his mother's eyes and his mother's patience, which is to say, considerable. Their mother, my ex-wife Donna, and I had divorced in 2014. 19 years of marriage, 2 good kids, a separation that was more exhaustion than conflict. She had moved to Phoenix. We talked occasionally and remained in the specific, careful way of people who have been very important to each other and are no longer cordial. I arrived in Rio on a Tuesday in March 2022. I had booked a hotel in Ipanema for 2 weeks with the intention of figuring out the rest from there. The hotel had a rooftop bar that was open in the evenings, which is where, on my 4th night, I met Fernanda. She was there with 2 friends, women in their 30s, animated and at ease in the way of people in a place they know well. She was the one facing the view when I sat down at the adjacent table, and she noticed me noticing the skyline and said, in English that was accented and fully confident, "First time?" I said, "That obvious?" She said, "You're looking at it the way people look at it the first time, like you're trying to memorize it." I said, "Is that what I'm doing?" She said, "Yes, it's a good instinct. It looks different after a while." Her name was Fernanda. She was 33, from Botafogo originally, now living in Leblon. She had been working in food, catering, event management, pop-up dinners for 8 years, building toward opening her own restaurant. She talked about food the way I talked about food, which is to say, with the specific authority of someone who has spent years thinking about it professionally and whose opinions are not casual. She knew the difference between the kind of food that keeps a room full and the kind that fills a room once. She knew what made a neighborhood work for a restaurant and what made it work against one. We talked for 3 hours on that rooftop. When her friends left, she stayed. When the bar closed, we walked along Leblon Beach for an hour in the warm dark, still talking. I told her about the diners, about Bridgeport and Pilsen, about 30 years of 6-day weeks. She told me about the restaurant she wanted to open, the concept, the neighborhood she had in mind, what she would serve and why. She had thought about it for years. It was not a dream, it was a plan. Plans and dreams are different things, and I could tell the difference after 30 years. I extended my hotel stay to a month. Then I found an apartment in Leblon, a 2-bedroom on the 6th floor with a view of the Deux Irmãos Hills that was, objectively, one of the most extraordinary things I had ever looked at regularly. $3,000 a month. I signed a 12-month lease. Fernanda and I were together by the end of April. She came to the apartment most evenings. We cooked together. She taught me things about Brazilian ingredients that I had not known, and I showed her techniques from the diner kitchen that she found interesting in the way that professionals in the same field find each other's approaches interesting. We were good in the kitchen together. I thought more than once that this was evidence of something. In May, she told me about the restaurant space she had found, a ground floor space in Botafogo, her old neighborhood, a corner unit on a street with foot traffic, a kitchen that had been roughed in by the previous tenant, a landlord willing to negotiate on the build-out. She had the concept ready. She had the supplier relationships. She had 8 years of catering contacts who would fill the room in the first month if she opened. What she did not have was the capital for the build-out and the first 6 months of operating reserve. She told me this not as a pitch, but as a frustration. She had been 3 months from this restaurant for 2 years. Always close, never quite there. I listened. I asked the questions I would have asked if someone had brought this to me as a business proposition. The space, how much per square meter, what was the lease term, what were the build-out costs, the operating model, average check, projected covers per night, staffing, food cost percentage. Her answers were good, not perfect. She was optimistic about the covers in the first 3 months, which is what restaurant people always are, and I knew from experience that the first 3 months are when you find out what you don't know. But the fundamentals were sound. The location was right. The concept was differentiated enough to stand out and accessible enough to fill seats. The supplier relationships were real. I said, "How much do you need to open?" She said, "I'm not asking you for that." I said, "I know. How much?" She said, "The build-out is 90,000. Operating reserve for 6 months is another 60. I have 20 of my own." I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I ran the numbers the way I had run numbers for 30 years. I called a Brazilian lawyer I had been introduced to through an expat forum and paid him to review the lease and the business registration framework. I visited the space twice, once with Fernanda and once alone. I walked the street at lunch and at dinner and on a Saturday morning and counted the foot traffic each time. I invested $130,000, not as a gift, as an investment, with a written agreement drafted by the lawyer specifying a 25% stake in the restaurant, returns to begin after the first year of operation, buyout option after 3 years. The agreement was real. The lawyer was real. The signatures were real. I was still careful enough for that. I was not careful enough for what came after. The build-out began in June. Fernanda managed it with the focused energy of someone who has been waiting for this for 8 years and is not going to let execution be the thing that stops her. She was at the space every day. She made decisions quickly and correctly. By August, the kitchen was done. By September, the dining room was taking shape. I was spending more time in Botafogo at the space, watching it become something. There is a specific satisfaction to watching a room become a restaurant. The moment the kitchen equipment arrives, the moment the lighting changes from construction fluorescence to something warmer, the moment the tables go in and the space stops being a project and starts being a place. I had felt it 3 times in my life, and I felt it again in Botafogo, and I thought, this is why I came to Rio. The restaurant opened in November 2022. The first 2 weeks were exactly what Fernanda had projected. The catering contacts came, the room was full, the food was good. I sat at the bar on the 3rd night and watched the room and thought, we did this. Whatever else this is or isn't, we built this thing and it is working. By January, the covers had dropped. Not catastrophically, to about 60% of the opening weeks, which is normal, and which I told Fernanda was normal. She understood it intellectually, but felt it in the way that owners of new restaurants feel every fluctuation, as evidence of something being wrong that they need to fix immediately. She was also, by January, receiving visits from her family with a frequency that I had not seen before the restaurant opened. Her mother, Dona Silvana, came twice a week. Her brother Caio had started working in the kitchen, which I had not been consulted about and which I raised once, carefully, and which Fernanda said was temporary. Her cousin had taken the front-of-house role that Fernanda had originally planned to hire for externally. The restaurant was becoming a family operation in ways that I had not anticipated and that the original business plan had not described. The money requests changed character after the restaurant opened. I want to tell you something about what it felt like to be inside that restaurant in the first weeks. Because I think it is important to understand the feeling before you understand the numbers, and the feeling is the reason the numbers went the way they went. I had opened 3 diners in my life. Each time, the opening weeks had a specific quality that I had never found a fully accurate word for. Not excitement. Excitement is too shallow. Not pride, though pride was part of it. Something more structural than either of those things. The specific satisfaction of a person who has built a thing from nothing and is standing inside the thing and watching it work. The kitchen producing food, the room filling with people, the sound of a dining room in service-y, the clatter and the conversation, and the particular hum of a space that is doing what it was designed to do. I had felt that 3 times in Chicago, and I felt it again in Botafogo in November 2022, and I thought, I came to Rio to feel something. This is what I came for. That feeling made me less careful than I should have been. I am being precise about this because I think precision matters here. The feeling did not make me stupid. It made me willing to absorb problems as costs of the business rather than signals about the business. There is a difference. In 30 years of running diners, I had always been able to see that difference clearly. Inside that restaurant in Botafogo, watching a room I had helped build fill with people, I stopped seeing it. Before the opening, they were investments. Structured, documented, part of a business I had analyzed and chosen to back. After the opening, they became something else. They came through Fernanda, as they always had, but now they were framed as restaurant needs. The walk-in cooler needed a repair. The supplier was requiring advance payment this month. The weekend event required additional staffing. Each request had a business rationale, and each business rationale was plausible because I was not inside the operation closely enough to verify it quickly, and because I had learned over 30 years that restaurants always need something and that the something is always urgent. By March 2023, I had put an additional $45,000 into the restaurant beyond the original investment. Some of it was documented, some was verbal agreements I had not gotten around to formalizing. Some was cash handed over on a Tuesday morning because the cooler was failing and the weekend was coming and there was no time to wire money and wait for it to clear. In April, Fernanda's mother needed money, not restaurant money, personal. Dona Silvana's apartment building in Madureira had failed its annual inspection, and the building association was requiring all owners to contribute to structural repairs. Her share was $11,000. She did not have $11,000. Fernanda asked me with the specific difficulty of someone who knows they are asking something significant and cannot find a way around asking it. I paid the $11,000. In May, Fernanda's brother Caio, the one working in the kitchen, had a legal problem. A dispute with a former employer over unpaid wages, now countersued by the employer for damages, requiring a lawyer at $1,500 a month with an estimated 4-month case, $6,000. I paid it. In June, the restaurant had a bad month. Covers dropped to 40% of the original projection. Fernanda said it was a seasonal pattern. June and July were slower. The summer crowd had not arrived yet. It would recover in August. I had seen seasonal patterns in 30 years of diners, and I knew the difference between a pattern and a problem, and I was not entirely sure which this was. I asked to see the books. Fernanda said she would have her accountant prepare a summary. The summary arrived 3 weeks later and was not complete enough to answer the questions I was asking. I asked again for the full books. There was a delay, then another delay. Then Fernanda said the accountant was changing systems and the transition had complicated the reporting. I said, Fernanda, I have 25% of this business. I need to see what is happening. She said, I know. I'll get you everything. Give me 2 more weeks. I gave her 2 weeks. The books did not arrive. What arrived instead was a conversation. Fernanda at the kitchen table in the Leblon apartment, serious and careful, saying that she needed to talk to me about the restaurant. She said the first year had been harder than expected. She said the projections had not held. She said the business needed additional capital to get through the difficult period and reach the point where it could sustain itself. She said she needed $70,000. I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, Fernanda, I need to see the books before I make any decision about additional capital. She said, I know. I'll get them to you this week. The books came 4 days later. I spent a full day going through them with the attention I had given to 30 years of my own numbers. What I found was this. The restaurant was not failing dramatically. It was failing slowly, in the specific way of a restaurant that is spending slightly more than it is making in every category, and that has been doing so since the 3rd month of operation, which is when the opening energy fades and the actual operating economics become visible. The food cost was too high. The labor cost, which had grown as the family involvement grew, was significantly above what the original model had projected. The events revenue that Fernanda had identified as a key component of the business model had not materialized at the projected volume. The covers were averaging 55% of projection across the first year. The restaurant was not a fraud. It was a real restaurant with real problems that a more careful operator might have caught earlier and corrected. I do not know if Fernanda had seen the numbers clearly and had not told me, or had not seen them clearly and had not wanted to look. Both possibilities say something about the situation. Neither possibility changes the number at the bottom of the column. I did not give her the 70,000. I said, I can't put more money into this without a restructuring plan. The labor costs need to come down. The food costs needs to come down. The events model needs to be rebuilt. If you want to do that work, I'll stay involved. If you don't, I need to understand what my exit looks like. She looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not anger, not defensiveness, but something closer to the specific tiredness of someone who has been managing a situation for a long time and has run out of energy to manage it further. She said, I think I need to close it. I said, close the restaurant? She said, yes. The restaurant closed in September 2023. The process of closing it, breaking the lease, settling with suppliers, selling the equipment, took 6 weeks and cost money rather than recovering it. My 25% stake returned approximately $12,000 after the settlement of debts. I had invested $175,000, counting the original stake and the subsequent infusions. I sat with that number for a while. Then I sat with the larger number. The apartment lease, 18 months at $3,000 a month, $54,000. The living expenses, the meals, the trips we had taken, a week in Fernando de Noronha in August 2022 that cost more than I had registered at the time, a long weekend in Gramado, the day-to-day cost of living in Leblon at the level I had been living, the family requests, Dona Silvana's building repair, Caio's lawyer, 2 smaller amounts for Fernanda's cousin that I had not itemized, the additional restaurant capital beyond the original investment, $541,000. In 20 months, I had $39,000 left. I sat at the kitchen table in the Leblon apartment, with $39,000 and a lease that expired in 2 months and a restaurant that had just closed, and I thought about what I was going to do next with the specific clarity that arrives when the number is small enough that you can no longer avoid thinking about it precisely. I called Marco Esposito. We had been friends since 1989, when he worked the prep station at a restaurant in Bridgeport, where I was the sous chef before I opened the first diner. He had retired to São Paulo 2 years earlier with his girlfriend Ana, a Brazilian woman he had met in Chicago. He had a 2-bedroom in Pinheiros. He had a couch. He said, "Jerry, come. We'll figure it out." I moved out of the Leblon apartment in October 2023. I sold what I could, the furniture I had bought for the apartment, some electronics, things that had accumulated over 20 months of living as though the money was not finite. The sale covered the last month's rent and left me with enough for a bus ticket to São Paulo and a small buffer. I said goodbye to Fernanda in the apartment before I left. She had come to help me pack some boxes, which she did efficiently and without much talk, the way you do work that needs doing when you have run out of things to say. When the last box was closed, she stood in the empty living room for a moment and she said, "I'm sorry about the restaurant." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry about everything else too." I said, "I know." Then she left, and I sat in the empty apartment for an hour and listened to the city below and thought about 30 years of diners in Chicago and $541,000 and a couch in Pinheiros, and how you get from one end of a sentence to the other. I was on Marco's couch for 6 weeks. He and Ana were kind in the specific way of people who understand that kindness in this context means not asking too many questions and making sure there is coffee in the morning. I worked through what my options were with the specific discipline I had applied to business problems for 30 years and had not applied to my own situation in Rio until the situation required it. I went back to Chicago in December 2023. My daughter Linda picked me up at O'Hare. She did not say "I told you so." She said, "Dad, I'm glad you're home." And then she cried a little, quickly, the way Linda cries, turning her face away. I have been a person who made other people cry with relief at my return twice in my life. Once when I came back from a hospitalization in 2008 that had scared everyone more than I had understood at the time, and once at O'Hare in December 2023. Both times the crying was about something larger than the event that prompted it. I want to tell you something about Marco's couch, because I think it deserves to be described accurately rather than passed over quickly as an ending. There is a specific quality to sleeping in someone else's living room when you are 66 years old and have spent 30 years building things that were yours. It is not the physical discomfort, the blanket too short, the pillow adequate but not quite right. It is the specific orientation of a person who has been the owner of rooms and is now a guest in one. I had been the owner of 3 kitchens and 2 apartments and the organizing presence of a 30-year business and a family. And on Marco's couch in Pinheiros at 3 in the morning, I was none of those things. I was a man with a blanket that didn't reach his feet and $39,000 and a flight to book. Marco got up early. He was a 5:30 person, always had been, a habit from the restaurant years that retirement had not broken. He made coffee, strong, the Brazilian way, in a small metal pot that produced something considerably more serious than what I had been drinking at the hotel in Ipanema. He left a cup outside the living room door without waking me, every morning for 6 weeks. That is a small thing, and it is not a small thing. I am in Chicago now. I am living in the 2nd bedroom of Linda's house in Evanston, which is a considerably better situation than Marco's couch, and which Linda has made clear is mine for as long as I need it. Paul came from Detroit for a week in January, and we talked, the three of us, Linda and Paul and me, about what happened and what comes next. They asked good questions. I answered them honestly. The honesty was uncomfortable, and also, I think, the right thing. I had 30 years of operating restaurants in Chicago. I know how to do that. There is a version of the next chapter that looks like what I have already done, smaller and more careful, with the specific knowledge of a person who has made large mistakes and understands what made them large. I am not sure yet if that is the version I want. I am sure that it is available, and that availability is something. I think about Rio. I think about it specifically. The rooftop bar on the fourth night, the walk along Leblon Beach in the dark, the morning I stood at the window of the sixth-floor apartment and watched the light on the Doigt Irmãos hills and thought, this is the best view I have ever had from a place I live. I think about Fernanda in the kitchen on a Sunday, cooking something that took 2 hours and that we ate on the balcony with the city below. I think about the restaurant in November, the third night, the room full, the food right, the specific satisfaction of a thing you built being what you intended it to be. Those things were real. The $39,000 was also real. The couch in Pinheiros was also real. The O'Hare Arrivals Hall in December, Linda crying and turning her face away, was also real. I ran 3 diners for 30 years. I can tell you with precision what a viable restaurant looks like from the inside and what a failing one looks like and what the difference is. I can tell you the food cost percentage that separates sustainable from not, the labor ratio that kills you slowly, the cover count that tells you whether you are building something or managing a decline. I can tell you all of that. What I cannot fully tell you is how a man who knows all of that ends up on his friend's couch in São Paulo with $39,000 after 20 months in Rio. I am still working on the answer to that question. What I have so far is this. I knew the business. I did not know myself inside the business. I knew how to read a restaurant's numbers. I stopped reading my own. I knew what it meant when someone you are in business with delays showing you the books. I told myself a different story about what it meant when it was Fernanda. We tell ourselves different stories about the people we love. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is something else. I am still trying to name it accurately. The couch was 6 weeks. The diners were 30 years. The apartment in Leblon with the view of the hills was 20 months. Rio was the most alive I had felt since I opened the first diner in Bridgeport in 1992 and stood in the dining room at 6 in the morning before service and thought, I built this. I built that too for a while. Then it cost what it cost. I'm in Evanston now. Linda makes coffee every morning. Paul calls on Sundays. The lake is 2 blocks away. It is cold in a way that Rio never was and never will be, and the cold is familiar in the specific way of places that shaped you before you knew you were being shaped. I don't know what comes next, but I've started every good chapter of my life not knowing what comes next. That part, at least, I recognize.